Welcome to today's webinar, DevSecOps, the missing link in delivering on the promise of business velocity. Now, I would like to introduce our very wonderful panel of presenters for today. Really, none of them need an introduction whatsoever. They're all very well-known thought leaders within the industry. Jean Kim, for starters, who is a very well-known multi-award-winning CTO, researcher, author, and of course founder of IT Revolution. And one thing that we love about Gene is that he's also our ZBL Lab strategic advisor. We also have a wonderful partner of ours joining today from Signal Sciences, James Wickett, who is the head of research there. James spends the majority of his time at the intersection of DevOps and security, so he's going to be adding some great commentary to today's presentation. He is also the author of several security and DevOps courses on lynda.com and LinkedIn Learning. And we will talk about it a little bit more at the end, but he is also in the process of writing a book. So hopefully he will share some details with us on that later on. And then we have Rob Stroud, Chief Product Officer here at ZBL Labs. He is also a recognized industry thought leader in DevOps and continuous deployment. And he's a former principal analyst at Forrester Research, where he helped large enterprises drive their DevOps transformation and guide them through organizational change. Welcome, gentlemen. We're very excited to have you all here.
All right, thanks for having us. It's great.
Thanks, and thanks, Jen, for everything, and thanks. It's great to be such two great industry luminaries today, and on one of my favorite topics. For those who don't know me well, I'm Rob Stroud, and I'm the CPO here at ZBL Labs, and I do security for fun. I do security on weekends, and I've been doing that most of my career. And it's really interesting that if we look at the ebb and flow of security over the course of my time in this industry, one of the things is we see it ebbs and flows, and sometimes it's higher profile than others. But in a world where software is driving business today, and the threat landscape is dramatically changing with threat vectors, still internal, but also the growing range of external threat vectors. Today, we're going to have a discussion on how DevOps and security meet together, and the thinking and the thoughts and the good patterns and the best patterns that you can use around them, and some of the forward thinking that's happening in the industry so that you can drive your DevOps initiative even further forward. And the real opportunity is for us that a lot of IT budgets are now spent on innovation and driving value and even a little bit of technical debt reduction. But often the security budget is hidden away, often only delivered to the organization after a major threat or vulnerability has impacted you or someone in your organization. So with that said, it's my honor to really just start this conversation off. And first, Gene, let's give us a bit of an oversight on some of the things that you've been seeing and
yeah, for sure.
This topic.
Yeah, in fact, Rob, you and I have known each other for over a decade, and it turns out that I have known James since 2011, and it was one of the most unforgettable meetings of my life just because of James' journey into security as an engineer, and so that was in 2011. But I think what really cemented James' place in one of my favorite people in the industry was the fact that he has organized conferences for almost over a decade, and specifically the OWASP USA conference. So this is like one of the largest security conferences, one of the most revered security professional organizations. And it was there that I saw one of the most astonishing talks that, in my mind, belongs up there in the pantheon of the top 10 most famous presentations of our industry. And it was a talk by Neil Mattal, Alex Smolin, and Jim Collins. Justin Collins, yes. Yeah. And they were the information security team at Twitter. So what they're showing on the presentation here is the Federal Trade Commission consent decree, where after the Barack Obama account was hacked and there were administrative credentials using a weak password, essentially they had to promise that they would be secure for the next 10 years. And thus was the beginning of modern information security engineering at Twitter. It was just one of those astonishing presentations for me that really reframed what does InfoSec need to do to genuinely prevent, detect, and correct when the security risks. And it really, for me, no more than anything else, really showed that the era of security coming at the very end interacting with the dev and ops and engineering teams primarily through PDF files was certainly coming to a close. James, you were in the room at the same time. I don't think I was the only one who was as shocked as me.
Yeah, right. I think that it was a really impressive time, and I think back to that moment at AppSec USA. It was 2012. I mean, DevOps had been on the scene for what, 2.5 years at that point, and we had really desired. So we'd said in Austin, Texas, like we're going to bring AppSec USA into Austin, and unlike traditional AppSec USA conferences or security conferences in general, we are going to try to fill the seats with a bunch of developers, and that was our main goal. So we had some really great talks at that point. But I remember thinking like half the audience, I think it was about 800 or 1,000 people at that time. It's grown bigger now, but like we had about half were developers, which people were pretty blown away with. And then at that talk specifically. It was sort of that it was uniting both kind of like security needs and their desires, both with the business, and it was aligning with what was going on with Twitter at the moment. Anyways, I thought it was. I agree with you that it was very important for our industry, that specifically that moment. And we've tried to continue to bring that security and DevOps story together. At a lot of the events that we've done here in Austin through DevOps Days or LastCon, which is a security conference, through similar related to OWASP. So yeah, I felt that. I do feel your thoughts on that. I think that was a really big moment for us.
And there's another thing that you were, I think, equally, stunning in terms of your ability to see where the industry was, and it was a specific ratio. A set of ratios that you shared with me that you mentioned in 2011, and I think it is as true now as it was back then. Can you walk us through that?
Oh yeah, Gene, that's a really good point. So I think when we start thinking about security and where security sits today, I really feel that security is in crisis. And I used to, and I say that, and it's a little bit dramatic, but I feel like when we look at how security and its place in most organizations, it's not deemed as a priority. It's often been kind of put to the back burner in the compliance and audit type framework sometimes. And I used to say, this is like maybe 7 or 8 years ago, or I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, I used to say, hey, security is like 7 years behind where operations was, right? So like operations is kind of a laggard to adopting Agile, and then they kind of brought into DevOps with that, and then now security is sort of coming on board, and we're seeing the kind of the tide change. But one of the things we talked about in the early days of DevOps was like for every 10 developers, you had 1 operations person. And some places that would be a little bit different, but more or less that was kind of the ratios that was happening. And it was true at many of the enterprise organizations I've worked at. And then I started to break down and think about like, well, what if you like extrapolate that to security as well? It's like 100 devs to 10 ops to 1 security person. And started looking around at numbers. I've seen some data points that confirm this. Most companies that have this, I like to go to conferences and present this, and people are like, it's usually like half. Like I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, like 100 developers to 10 operations to like half of a security person, or a third, right? We have 300 developers, 1 security person, and I always find that funny, but it is representative of the inequitable distribution of labor that we have in IT, and the way we've sort of built security up. We've set them up to fail, much like operations did, and we've sort of staffed in this kind of old waterfall model whenever we've sort of shifted the way we do development, the speed, the cadence, all that sort of stuff. And now security has to like find a way to keep up, right? I don't know, Gene, does that resonate with you? Rob, are you seeing this as well?
Yeah. So in my time in banking, where I was in both the operations and security teams at different times, I was just doing the math while you were talking, and actually our ratios were more like 100 to 8 to about 0.25, and our 0.25 security team, we were basically charged with writing those PDFs you mentioned before, and then we had to go through and give those PDFs to the audit department, who would walk around and hit the dev team with a brick with them, right? Like you need to do this. and it was all implemented. All the security was implemented, to Gene's point, after the fact. The application was ready. We'd done our testing. We were ready to move to the next stage, and then along came the security team and said, have you met this 32-page checklist, right? And if you hadn't taken it into account as you were doing your coding, it could be a 3 to 6 month delay. So it doesn't work well in a DevOps environment, does it?
Right, and it puts security in a situation that's not a pleasant situation to be in, and it's the same place that operations was as well, right? Because DevOps was born out of that whole throw it over the wall, like developers are done coding it, so like we're going to throw it into production, and then a month later, like the operations person's getting paged, every 2 hours, and is like, hating life, right? And because the app really wasn't ready, wasn't production grade, wasn't set up to actually handle the load that it was meant to have, right? And security is now kind of, I would say, even a much worse spot in a lot of organizations than ops was, a decade ago.
So I think problem hypothesis confirmed. What are we doing about it, James?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I also will say that I think it's not like, we can come to the industry, and I think developers and operations folks can sort of talk about it. But I think this is a great quote by Steve Beloven, who's wrote this book called Thinking Security. He is a long-standing name in the InfoSec community. Wrote like the book on firewalls in the late 90s. But he wrote this, and this is sort of a real condemning statement, but it's very open. It's from a security professional to other security professionals, and they say, companies are spending a great deal on security, but we read of massive computer-related attacks. As something is clearly wrong, where the root of the problem is twofold. We're protecting the wrong things, and we're hurting productivity in the process. I find this is really interesting, and I think we'll talk about this some more later. But when you look at like even just the number of breaches that are coming in, right? If you look, 40% or so of breaches are coming in at the application layer, yet 3-4% of actual budgets go to that. We're still spending money kind of on a lot of network-based appliances or other types of approaches to security. We're not aligning kind of our spend to the right places. But the worst part here is, so we're protecting the wrong things. We're not lining up there. But then, hey, we're also hurting productivity, like Rob, you mentioned, right? It's like if you delay a project by 3 to 6 months, like you are no one's friend inside of the organization.
Another providential prophetic statement.
There you go. Well, so Gene, I think we want to talk a little bit about what is the new cadence that security is fitting. What do you see out there towards that?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, take a look at even how at Capital One, Topo Pal, he doesn't call it DevOps, he calls it DevOpsSec. And I think now more than ever, we are seeing the true integration of information security objectives into the technology value stream. And so, that's far more than just, dev to ops, dev to QA to ops, right? It is really, how do we truly integrate all the preventive, detective, and corrective controls into everyone's daily work? And, by the way, I am very envious that you are working with Nick Galbraith and Zane Lackey, who helped pioneer so many of these practices as they led the security programs at Etsy. So I mean, I totally agree with your thesis that there's something genuinely transformative afoot.
Yeah, and I think do you find that that parallel to where operations was? Because I still, you talk about how when we met, I was thinking about that, and it's like I read your book Visible Ops, many years ago, and when we met, I was actually really excited to meet you. I was like a little bit starstruck, Gene, because your book had such a big impact in my career, and like how we had decided to kind of renew our operations effort, and how we were sort of applying some of the principles in that book towards our day-to-day life, and we were doing that alongside doing kind of DevOps at the same time.
And if I could reciprocate, and I say this, I think I've told you this, but if not, I'm actually embarrassed that I'm waited this long. And when we met, it was so clear that you had taken some of those ideas and just took them so much further than I ever could. The fact that you were living in the information security function, which was a world I had left, probably as an area of interest, primary area of interest, probably 7 years prior. And so I think the fact that you had put together such a great, amazing set of talks at OWASP USA, especially that Twitter talk, right? Just showed, how much the game is changing for security. I just found it so invigorating and exciting. And so that was, yeah, I mean, you were right on.
Okay, yeah. Well, and I feel like and I feel like we're still kind of battling that. I mean, Rob, are you seeing out there that like, okay, some folks, because you look at this slide, I look at this slide, and I see Etsy. Yes, Etsy has been a really great place for innovation for the DevOps world. Netflix as well, right? We could probably list off, a dozen companies off the top of our head that have done really well. But like, are we seeing this across the board? Like, is security adopting this new cadence, or is there still a problem?
So, based on what I'm seeing, a large number of organizations now, those that are heavily into DevOps, it's part of the DevOps maturity curve. And I didn't put that slide in the deck today, but, one of the things we see is typically they'll just look at going, develop faster and then, work out how to deploy faster. But the reality of it is that to your point, I was with a large manufacturing organization recently, and they said that, they've got the dev and the ops part going quite well, but they totally overlook security. And, now they're having to go back and rethink their nature and how they're running in their DNA. And then you made a great quote before about, the mismatch of money in terms of application security, right? And app layer security. I mean, everybody thinks they've put a firewall in place, they've got user authentication, they've got some other bits and pieces, and they're done. The reality of it is you need to, with the new attack surface, and I keep going back to the cyber threats that we're all seeing for all organizations, because if every organization is a software company, you're not going to look to exploit the organization with a bank robbery, a physical bank robbery. You're going to do it through technology now. And therefore the threat landscape is definitely changing, and you have to rethink the way you do everything, code deploy. And I actually think one of the great things about DevOps, it allows you to do it faster. And, organizations learn this. One of the great quotes from my time in my last role was a large financial services organization saying they had to do DevOps with security included because it was the only way they could enhance their product quality and deliver the products and services offered to their customers.
Can I propose we go to slide 10 so we can talk about some of these more concrete patterns of what is so different? Or do you want to
Well, yeah. I think it might help. Maybe Rob, could you talk us through this a little bit? Yeah. Like because we're kind of like hitting to like, all right, well, because I think Gene, you're hitting on this, right? Well, so now what do we do? What are some main things? But it might be helpful just to like give us a brief overview of this pipeline, apart from security, right? So Rob, can you like walk us through it?
Yeah. And that's, this is the interesting point, right? You look at this diagram. This is a standard, DevOps pipeline, right? And a CI/CD pipeline. You've got planning, and of course, we do some code and we build it and we test it and we release it and then we monitor it. And there's feedback loops built in and all sorts of stages involved. And the interesting aspect of all of this is that and this is, you can go to 100 different websites and get 100 different versions of this diagram. Many organizations don't embed security as part of the base DNA. And I think that's, the one change I've seen in the last 18 months in the industry is the word sec. Now, whether you call it DevSecOps or DevOpsSec or SecDevOps, and all three have their supporters and detractors, this is a really key thing. And if you think about security as a whole, once you go through your stage of dev, test, UAT, and production, and whatever it looks like, whether it's containers, cloud, on-premise, it doesn't really matter, right? The security aspects need to be built in at that point. The reality is, if you don't have your security built in at that point in time, and if it's not completely on the left, and you've not gone through the various stages, you're going to release an artifact faster that potentially is vulnerable if it avoids the security phase. And if it does adopt it, then you're going to have a delay potentially. So this is, like a standard pipeline. I know we've got a derivation of it a bit further on, but, this is just a standard pipeline in the industry.
Yeah, and I think that kind of sets the stage, right? So now what do we do? What is this thing that we call DevOps and security combined together, this DevSecOps piece? And I like to use the definition whenever people talk about like, what is DevOps? What does it really mean? Are we talking about just automation or whatever? I kind of arrive at this, and it's DevSecOps is the extension of the DevOps culture for the inclusion of security. And below there, I have three kind of points. I'm actually working on a book for IT Revolution on DevSecOps and a lot of these principles. Out of that, we have a dozen or so things that we've been working on for that. But I've picked three here that I thought we could talk about that would be helpful for just this conversation. And then I think at the very end, I have a way, if people are interested in the book or interested, would like to have their story told, they can send me an email. I'd love to talk to you more about that. But Gene, Rob, what do you think about this definition? You guys ready to talk about some of these principles here?
I just find it exciting because it's a different way to think about. It's a dramatically different language, which I find very exciting, right? As opposed to let's view it from the COBIT framework, right? As control objectives and so forth. So I'm really excited for this section just because I think you're bringing a dramatically different way of how to think about security. It's not just for the security professional, but for everyone in the value stream.
Yeah, that's right. I think we have to take that ISC squared CISSP book, off the shelf and say, all right, what is it of this that we can actually keep, right? And then how does this change, right? Because so much of it's written towards that waterfall type perspective.
Yeah. By the way, I was just cleaning out my office, and I found my ISACA CISA certification from 2006. So yes, I know those books well.
Yeah. There you go. Well, I think the three I want to talk about are design for the worst case, test for security across the pipeline, and we just kind of went over the pipeline, and we're going to review that again with that injected all over. And then another one that I think that's interesting and may not be on people's radar, but abandon the AppSec training fallacy. So there's a little bit of drama built in there. So hopefully we'll hit that one as well. So. Let's dive into the first one, design for the worst case. Okay, so Gene, Rob, when you hear design for the worst case, what do you guys think?
Oh man, I think I'm thinking Chaos Monkey. I'm thinking about resilience engineering. Thinking about true integration of security into the design process. It's exciting. Well, whatever it is, it's exciting.
Yeah, right. And it's like being able to understand what are the bad things that could happen to my application.
Yeah, and one of the things, and now I'm in a role of a CPO. It's one of the things I always tell the team now is you need to really start designing for those fringe use cases, those use cases that you might not see that are going to bite you in the what later. You need to start thinking through, the happy path, which is what we typically code for, is not always the path our user community will go through the product anyway, right? No matter what your application is. So it's one of the things I love doing is, almost, Gene mentioned Chaos Monkey. I almost like getting, my 11-year-old grandson, who's probably more computer literate than me already, and getting him on the keyboard with the application and letting him try it, because he thinks of things in all sorts of novel ways. They're not nefarious, but they're really interesting, and you pretty quickly find that your security may not quite be there.
So it's like attempt to find the sad path through the system, right? It's like try to find a way to break it. And I think that's a great way to think about it. This is some of the concepts here are cataloged in like evil user stories, or being able to do threat modeling to think through the different aspects of it. Shostak, Adam Shostak has a great book on threat modeling that I find really useful. I've taken even in sort of DevOps teams, I've taken teams through kind of the threat modeling process, and we've done, just an hour or 2 hours of time, is able to really uncover some things we thought, we really should write some tickets for this, write some new tests for this. Have either of you guys heard of the Mozilla Rapid Risk Assessments? It's all right. It's one of those really cool things that if you're in an agile, this is one I think the evil user stories and threat modeling, those are kind of commonly accepted, or at least the threat modeling has come through. But evil user stories is a testing pattern that if you're doing agile like that, you may have heard of that, or TDD stuff. But Mozilla Rapid Risk Assessments is great because it's a tabletop exercise that can take about 30 minutes or so or less to do, and it's great on a sprint by sprint basis. So if you find yourself in an agile workshop or an agile shop, like, pull this in, try to do this with the team, if not every sprint, every other sprint, and try to put this together in place. So it's a real nice lightweight version that kind of mixes both some of the evil user story stuff and the threat modeling things. So
Actually, can you walk us through each one of these and just give us 30 seconds, even a minute on each one?
Yeah. So okay, if you look at like something like bulkhead patterns, like when you think of bulkheads, right? It stops the spillover from one item to the other, right? So this is isolating dependencies. So whenever you're designing your code, you try to separate out the dependencies and what the effects can have in this. Great stuff for security is that a lot of this is being done by the microservices movement as well. So the last few years have brought us a decent amount of that, and everybody splitting up big services into little ones. So you naturally need to put in bulkheads in place like that when you're sort of distributing your system that way. Evil user stories is writing in kind of in a language such similar to like behavior-driven development stuff, like you can write it in like a Cucumber or something like that, or but it's able to say like if a user goes to this site and they try to inject some cross-site scripting, like will they be successful, right? And you can kind of go further down that path, right? It doesn't have to just be but that's like the start of the language behind thinking some of that. One of the tools that I've worked on, an open source tool called Gauntlet, does some of that type of work. But it instruments tooling inside of your development environment to do that level of testing.
Actually, maybe I can't pause for a minute. Maybe we should go. So yeah, the bulkhead pattern, right? That was made famous by Mike Nygaard in his book Release It, about being very deliberate about what your design failure modes are. And he famously said in that book, if you don't deliberately design them, they will randomly be created for you in production. And so the goal of like circuit breakers is to sort of contain failures. And so I'd love how you're generalizing that to information security, where presumably it's just about like information containment, where just because I can get compromised this part of the system, I can't then get global access among many other properties.
That's right, Gene. Yeah, and thanks for mentioning Nygaard. I had made a mental note, just like say Nygaard, say Showstack, because I think those are two great resources to check out. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, definitely Mike Nygaard's book Release It's great, or Showstack's book on threat modeling is great.
Right, and so what I love, and I think what I love about that is also what you've done with evil user stories. Again, using the language that any developer is used to in terms of like, we accept work from product management, and whether expressed as a customer journey or as a use case specific behavior-driven design. Well, actually, like a user story. Here's something that we can do either to make it look like a user story or as a Cucumber design test case. I just love how, again, you're making it very easy for a developer to know exactly what you're talking about without getting into the sometimes arcane language of security.
Yeah, hey Gene, what and Rob too, really, like the traditional way that we've done this, right? Or for security, just to sort of generalize throughout the industry. At the end of the cycle, run a scanner, right, and get produce X number of results, large number, and then create a ticket, or if you're well intentioned, you maybe create 1,000 tickets, right, and then you throw that over to your developers, right? I've heard it going both ways, right? One ticket with 1,000 items, or 1,000 tickets with one item, and the developers go and they look at it and they're like, I have no idea what this means, right? And then they go and they try to validate it. It doesn't validate, and it's But where I see like high performing security organizations doing really well is whenever they're writing this and using the language and the patterns and the testing frameworks that the team is already has in place. And so being able to express security concerns, but in an agile type pattern, right? So being able to say, okay, here's some user stories that people could do through the system, and it requires a culture change. Like the first thing we said about DevSecOps, it's not about like technology; it's a culture change. Like you have to, as a security person, need to say, I'm going to work inside of the culture I'm in, and not kind of silo myself off from everybody else. And the inverse is also true.
Yeah, by the way, I think this is what has always been so groundbreaking about your thinking is just reframing so many of these things that I've known for decades, but putting them into something where a developer can understand it. And holy cow, you can see the aha moments that are just like my aha moments. Like, oh yes, exactly, James is, this is gonna work. Can you walk me through threat modeling and rapid risk assessment as well?
Well, yeah, Gene, one more point on that. Like we're security needs to shamelessly steal from, and DevSecOps needs to shamelessly steal from what happened to operations with the DevOps movement.
Absolutely.
Because we need to take a page out of that, because it can't be this, if we don't put the developers first, which is what we did for operations, that we're going to have some problems. So threat modeling is taking all the main elements of your system and then putting like stride or dread and trying to understand those are like security frameworks to help you understand what types of things might be at risk. So I find that's a really helpful thing to do. And if you can bring in kind of some security knowledge share, remember you're the one in the 110 to 1, and so you need to work upwards to help the 100 understand the concerns of the 1. And so doing a threat modeling exercise helps sort of elicit some of that. So you take like a data flow diagram or some other thing, and then over each element you ask some security specific questions over that. And then out of that, you can have a meaningful conversation between development and security. You can write up some useful type user stories or some tickets or some items of things that you want to put in your testing system. And that's really helpful. And then I'd say Mozilla Rapid Risk Assessment, that is a way to do some of these actions in a very fast, agile type manner. So threat modeling, you might not do, like a full threat modeling session. You wouldn't necessarily do that, every sprint. You would maybe do that, across your system on kind of major design changes or whatever. Rapid risk assessments, it's like, hey, what's the stuff we're changing in the sprint? Let's talk about that. What is that? How does that apply? And it's just a series of framework of questions that's really helpful for that.
Awesome. That you can integrate into sort of the implementation design stage.
That's right. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay, yeah. So let's hit it into okay. So we've already kind of spent some time talking about testing. Let's dive into that a little bit deeper. How do we test for security across the pipeline? We're going to talk about the pipeline next. And so I'll just mention a couple things here. Adversity testing, that's putting security testing and security attack tooling inside of your pipeline to do the testing. Thinking about security as code. So I mentioned this already. We talked about how we really have to involve developers in this, but it's a similar pattern that infrastructure as code, and the movement. If you're unfamiliar with infrastructure as code, is a movement that was affected from that. We need to take that same type approach. So if you rewind the clock 10 years ago, systems were all kind of hand built, or some scripts and some operations people did some magic to get them all set up. Cloud came out, DevOps came out, the config management tools came out, and a lot of the industry sort of shifted to say, all my infrastructure, that's a codified system. Well, we need to do this, and that's the only way you can scale the 10 people to the 100 developers. Well, we're in a worst case of security. We're the 1 security person to the 100 developers and to the 10 operations people. So you have to figure out a way to codify your security, and I think doing some of these testing ways are to do that.
And all the 100 developers can push to production.
That's right. Yeah, it's a dramatically different world we see ourselves today than we did a decade ago. And security is sort of, at some organizations, security has learned this. At other ones, they are just now picking it up and kind of making progression, which is totally fine. It's understandable. But to make the jump and to do well, these are some things to inject testing. I think, Rob, you have a slide next, so we can talk about where all that stuff fits in, right?
So I think maybe just to make sure that we address each one of these, and extract all the knowledge from you out of it. So security code, I totally get, right? I mean, I love the fact that in the ideal, right, we want every bit of knowledge from that security professional not in their heads and not in a checklist and not in a wiki page. We want it in the code, right? So ideally in a shared code repo, you can pull from it, security settings, libraries, authentication patterns, right? We don't want 40 of them, we want 1, right? Especially when all of infrastructure is code, right? We want all the security patterns integrated into those. So that's what you're talking about when you say security is code, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah, and you're right to think about it as like no longer policy or procedure documents, but like it's actually like treating it as part of the system. One of my co-authors for the DevSecOps book is Ernest Muller, and we were given a talk a couple weeks ago, and he quoted, which I thought was great. He quoted Adrian Cockcroft from his time over at Netflix, and he said Netflix has no policies. No, it doesn't have any policy. And Ernest was like, what does that even mean? Like, how can you be an organization without policy? And so, but after kind of unwinding it, it's like Netflix has codified everything. All their policies are treated as code. So it's like you, by participating in the development practice, like you are sort of adhering to kind of engineering's policies, but there's not like an explicit document that sort of outlays it. Like the delivery pipeline sort of enforces the policy,
Right.
and it really helps separate that for developers. It's like I'm not coding to some sort of standard. I'm coding to like passing or failing tests, and that's the language. That's the currency the developers speak naturally. So it really makes sense for operations and security to kind of get on board with that.
And before you go on to static analysis, dynamic analysis, can you just say 30 seconds on what exactly adversity testing is?
Oh yeah, well I think like adversity testing is that methodology of taking real live attack tooling and injecting it inside of your delivery pipeline or your testing
Like
pipeline.
Metasploit or
Metasploit is a good example. Could be anything, like web scanners like Nikdo or Arachne or SQLi or whatever, right? Just or I'm sorry, SQL Map for SQLi testing. So like you can put all that in there and just adding that to your system. That helps that kind of adds that adversity during the development process.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, right. These are tools used in the wild by real attackers. We should be using them too as part of our.
Yeah, Gene, that's exactly right. That's the theory behind that, right? It's like, like anyone on the internet can download these tools and run them against your site. Why would you not run them against yourself first? It's like that. It seems common sense when you think about it.
Brilliant. And then static dynamic testing.
Oh yeah. So this is just this is SAS-IAST. You can really think about it as like source code scanning or dynamic scanning, or and this is the putting all this together inside of your system. So and it's applying testing at the different layers. So you do SAST at the very at the development end, and you put DAST kind of at the dynamic side once the site's up and built, and then the IAST you can put in the middle. You instrument the middle bits. So.
And what does IAST stand for?
I thought you might ask me that. I was like, is it integrated application security testing? I can't.
Right. It is the stuff in the middle, right? Yeah, exactly right. And so that's where you're hitting the things in the middle, like at the inner just like integration testing is you're hitting the system as a whole, not the components themselves.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because one of the things as I've been in my travels and doing a lot of work on this area is, a large healthcare organization. I love the tactics that they used recently in the Midwest, where they actually took their ratio, by the way, was better than our 100 to 10 to 1. They had a ratio of about 100 to 10 to 1.5, and the CIO actually made an interesting, brave decision. He actually took to transfer the skills of security team to the dev teams. He actually went and placed those security specialists in each of the product teams for a period of time. And it became their full-time job for at least one release, with the objective of handing over the skills. And it was very interesting that the exercise worked so well that now the security policy team is a small team, and security has become a community of practice. And the security folks have become key players in the team. Now I'm not sure we can all afford 300 security folks, right? But one in each team. But it's kind of an interesting practice that we've started to see out here in an industry that was highly vulnerable. So yeah.
Yep, and I was wrong. I asked the I and I asked is not integrated. It's interactive, right? So
Interactive. If I was just about
yeah,
to say, I was like, I was wrong too.
I was like, oh, geez, why did that slip my tongue there? Yeah. So,
Yeah,
but
no,
what it does is it ties the dynamic scanners to the lines of code that are actually executed. So, like a common way to do it is like you instrument your JVM or whatever, and then you run attack tooling against it, and you're able to tie those things together. So, that's a real helpful way to take a look at it.
Awesome.
and
Okay, so yeah, Rob, sorry to kind of,
yeah,
I just wanted to make sure I got that right.
no, I was just keeping us moving here. So one of the interesting things, and you've talked a lot about this in the last slide, James and Jean, you've added a lot of color there, but this is one of the things we're now starting to see, and you saw the pipeline before, and security is now, if you start to look at the various security steps, and by the way, we're about to talk about even more advanced functions than these in a second. But I was at a major security risk audit and compliance event on the west coast of the US earlier this week, and one of the interesting things, talking to the teams there, I had that. And we're going to talk about auditors in a few moments, but one of the interesting things was the audit in this particular large financial services organisation and a government organisation. The audit team are leading the charge with their DevOps initiatives now, so that all these various testing components are actually delivered. Some of these are culture, some of these are tooling, some of these are techniques, but these things happen along the pipeline. I don't plan on going into deep detail of a lot of these because James, you've already touched on some of these. But the reality of it is that if we look at the security as code approach, one of the cool things you can do is apply these components, these tests, these stages into integrated pipelines. And this is one of the things we see leveraged and used by a lot of organizations now, where they go and grab their security testing now, and the developer will just write their code. Of course, they're now using secure coding techniques and much better practices. And as they push the code along, because they have such a great integrated approach in security as code, the various security steps based on risk assurance, on the risk assessment, are now starting to automatically populate the pipeline. But it still requires a bit of advanced thinking. So, once again, we talked about the happy path and the sad path before. The reality of it is that we still see left to their own devices. Some people just want to go fast, and in going fast, they'll follow the happy path. And from time to time, you need the mindset change imposed, so that you're starting to do things like looking at the performance of the application. I don't mean from a transaction processing perspective, but can you break into the system by overloading the system? It should automatically scale, so that doesn't happen. What about fuzzing, for instance, where you throw huge and erroneous character sets at applications to see what happens? These type of practices, and these are the things that we're now starting to see looking organisations just populate the process with to make the development and the security part just merge very nicely into the operations part, using good operations practices, making it very simple for the organisation to do that.
Hey, just a comment, Rob. I think this is such a useful diagram, because I think any security practitioner will look at this, and then and often they'll have this either or aha moment of like, here's ways that I can add value to this the software delivery process.
Yeah, I found myself kind of in a similar situation. You were talking about just adding fuzzing techniques, right? And we were building some of our first cloud-based products in 2010, and at a company I was at, back then, and I said, well, hey, what would happen if we started throwing a bunch of random fuzzing or whatever? And we've been working with some previous some folks that have been really kind of geared towards desktop development, and they had sort of said, oh, we want to join the cloud team, and I was like, well, let's just do that, right? So I just renamed some Ubuntu ISOs and just threw gigs at it, right? It totally broke, right? It didn't cause a exploit or whatever, but we found 5 bugs that day, right? And that's just because if you take a security mindset for something and you apply it to traditional development, some really good things happen, but it's a cultural thing. It's not like rocket science on some of this stuff, right? It's just applying kind of that Venn diagram between security and development and helping that conversation happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's keep moving in the interest of time.
Oh yeah, this is great. So this is the last one I think that's a little bit interesting. So I work at Signal Sciences. Signal Sciences, we provide application security kind of on the far operations end, right? So we instrument and monitor for like OWASP type stuff, and we function as like a next generation web application firewall. So when we started the company, I was really excited, and it's like, oh yeah, the WAF market like does need to get kind of get moved over. And then I started doing some research. It's like, well, why did like really as a whole we sort of abandoned web application firewalls in like in a real terms of defense as industry? And I found in like and I remember it, you know, as a side back in '06 or something like that. It was like there was the whole like WAF suck movement, right? And it's like you just need to train developers to like write secure code. And I've now dubbed this as what I think is the AppSec training fallacy. I think that we had security had this sort of what I think we can now say is a pretty naive notion that you could train people to write secure code, and I think that you should definitely have awareness of what's going on, teach people, you know, good practices. But you know, and I think we need to understand, like, it's still humans writing code. Per, you know, 10,000 lines of code, there's going to be a certain amount of error rate, you know, statistically speaking. A certain number of those are going to be security related, and a certain number of those are going to be vulnerable. And so we can't really fix the problem by like training ourselves out of the problem. And the other problem I've always seen, I don't know, you guys probably seen this as well. It's like you set up an AppSec training program, teach people all about it. They become really good at it. They kind of put that on their LinkedIn profile, you know, and then like 3 months later they're gone. You're like, ah, geez, like, what are we gonna do now? Like, you gotta like so you train everybody, and then now like now your best developers are out because a recruiter just called them and said, hey, well, you have security training, like we will pay you even more. So it's a problem. And I feel like this is similar to you know, like we've talked about this earlier. Like we didn't, when operations and the DevOps movement came out, like, we didn't say like, hey, let's just train devs to write, you know, more operational better code, right? We said, hey, let's add in automation. Let's codify all this stuff and put in instrument. So automation on the back end, and let's add instrumentation on the front end. And there's a big, you know, anybody's doing in the DevOps movement, it's like tons of monitoring tools. Like we've had a proliferation of them over the last decade, and they've been really great for us. And security is undergoing that same transformation, like better automation on the left and more instrumentation and monitoring tools for security stuff on the far right and the production side of that diagram. I mentioned a couple things in here. I have some like doing good code hygiene, but like don't make it hygiene that like is enforced by people, but enforced by the system, the deployment system, and ideas for other things that people might want to check out. This is just a tool reference. I didn't fill this whole deck with a bunch of tool references, but like OWASP dependency check is a really great thing to put as far as your automated testing tooling, and it's free, all that kind of stuff. So.
This has been an area of newfound passion for me. But yeah, I guess just to your one point, I mean, I was at the Loco Moco conference that was actually Neil Matadel, who left Twitter and now at GitHub, and they do a wonderful conference out there with Jeremiah, and Grossman and team. But there's a one talk that was given by a security researcher, and it's all about sort of the how do you attack the DOM in the browser? And he wrote a tool called DOM Purify, and he was describing what you need to do to make sure that you don't get code injected into the DOM by hostile JavaScript components. And his recommendations were great, but like there's no way I can't see myself doing that, right? It's like that can't be my responsibility. That has to be in the compiler or something, right? It's like to expect training and 100% compliance to this very inconvenient thing to do. I mean, I don't want to say it's hopeless, but I wouldn't bet money on it. Does that resonate with you?
Oh yeah, that resonates big time. I think about what, Gene, if you think back to like the Velocity conferences and like how that sort of started operational, and that's sort of where the birthplace genesis of DevOps came out of too, right? But it's like, what did we do? We took a bunch of operations and back-end engineers, and we took a lot of like front-end UI developers with Souders and stuff, and then jammed them all together in a conference. And then out of that and through other part of that ecosystem, there's tooling built to like the YSlow tool, right? It's like, oh, like you've done some things here that like have made it, not performant. Oh, then we start looking at back-end stuff, but we start building frameworks and toolings to solve these problems. Yes, like we do need to have some research to like illustrate that, but yeah, you're not going to teach everybody all those like JavaScript techniques you're talking about right there. Like that's just not gonna happen.
In fact, what a great segue to this slide. So the OS dependency check by Jeremy Long, just
Yep.
phenomenal. You actually taught me about this a couple years ago. So I read this paper that was just stunning to me, right? So the question is, everyone should patch, but why is it so difficult to patch? And I read this paper, and they monitored a group of researchers. They monitored 400 libraries. In 116 days, they found 282 commits that broke the API. In other words, they changed the interface. So not all of them would turn into the release, but I mean, like, but what this meant is that for any given day, for any given dependency, there's a 6.1% chance of a breaking change. So the conclusion for me was there's a huge economic cost of taking a dependency. And the reason why we don't patch is because it's so, every time you do, right, you break stuff. And so Jeremy Long has been actually very articulate about saying, to be secure, don't just update, the high CVSS score vulnerabilities, just stay current. And that is,
Exactly.
That's the bigger problem. This is a stunning problem. And I can say from personal experience that, it's taken me days to get my dependencies updated in, the JVM ecosystem.
Yeah, it's got to be something.
It spans languages.
Yeah. I mean, this is just a basic, DevSecOps hygiene 101. That, if people don't remember anything else from this, they should remember that, right? You've just got to keep on top of that.
Oh yeah, in fact, to make it even more prescriptive, every team, this clearly says that every team has to dedicate some amount of time on some sort of regular basis just to get current. Because if you don't, then you will be hopelessly and even further behind.
That's true. I was glad to see that this was Java, because I was like, oh, this is about Ruby, because like I felt all this pain, with that, right? So
it's worse with Ruby because at least with Java, you can statically find these interface changes. When in a dynamic language, you can't. So.
But talking about dynamic, I need to just update. I mean, one of the things, Gene, at the recent DevOps event that you hosted, and thank you very much. I work with a great bunch of people, a great number of us out of the industry, because one of the interesting things, as I've already shared, is that the audit community is really starting to look at how they get their hands around DevOps, and DevSecOps to them is just a wonderful answer, because one of the things they're looking at doing is really getting ingrained, because we talk about DevSecOps. I mean, soon we'll be talking about DevSec audit ops with some hope. Because the reality is we want to start shifting these things left. So, this is a great letter, and if we had time, Gina or I would read the whole letter to you. But the reality of it is that we really need to realize that we need to build in the audit capabilities. And, as I tell people, those who don't know, I'm heavily involved in ISACA, and one of the things in the ISACA IT audit community is they realize they too are going through a transformation now that needs to mirror the transformation that is in DevSecOps, so that we can actually bring audit into the pipeline, because it's meant to be our friend, not our enemy. Unfortunately, too often it's treated that way. Gene, you might want to add just a little bit of color to this before we move on.
No, I think it's just wonderful. I mean, just someone actually, head of engineering at a large publicly traded company, they actually copy and pasted this letter, sent it to their head of audit, head of security, and the responses were just unbelievable. One said, thank you so much for that wonderful note. I only wish I had a love letter to send you back in return. The other person saying, next time that you're in this, headquarters, let's meet, even for 30 minutes to talk about how we can change the way we work. I mean, this is one of the most brilliant creations, and anyone who wants to bridge the gap between DevOps, security, and audit, or security, right? This is a phenomenal way to start. Way to
And we're
go,
open
team.
for pull requests. We're open for pull requests now.
Right on, right on.
Yeah, I think the last thing that I'll mention is just I think as the other bridge is like how do we adequately make time for security? And one of the things I'm just really excited about is some work that's being done by McKirsten saying, hey, in any given type of anything that we work on as an engineering organization, it really actually belongs in 4 categories: features, defects, risks, and debts. And as he says, they're mutually exclusive, comprehensively exhaustive. In other words, it only goes into one category, and these 4 categories carry them all. So on the next slide, I think what this shows is that, just the way I think as engineers, the problem is always it's all about features. We don't get enough time to work on technical debt, and yet if you sort of just graph out kind of where is the work being spent, it actually turned out to be very powerful, because now we can actually have a conversation with leadership. It's like, how much should we be spending on features? How much should we be spending on defects in the features that we wrote in the created in the work of creating features? How much do we need to do to contain risk? And that's often security and compliance. Like GDPR actually probably injected a huge bunch of risk work in most organizations. And debts, like we are constantly creating tech debt in our daily work. It has to be paid down. And just to be able to say, hey, when we release a product, defects go up, because that's the way life works. And we have to fix that, but we also have to make architectural changes to make developers more productive, or make our platform more secure. So I'm very excited about how this might change discussions, between DevOps and security and business product leadership. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, Gene, I look at this in my own role, right? I look at this and, I say to myself, these truths are self-evident, right? I just find myself saying that as I see this graph, right? And the reality it is, if you don't spend time on tech debt and bug reduction and those types of things, if you don't have a quota for it, you actually don't get better, and you actually introduce security bugs over time, right? It's the nature of all code. It has bugs. I haven't worked out how to code perfectly yet. Maybe you have.
And I think you really landed the point I was trying to make. Thank you. It's like, and left unaddressed, the amount of time you spend on features goes to zero. And that has been shown true time and time again. The whole security stand down that we're talking about, after SQL Slammer, Microsoft worked on no features for a year, and worked on hardening every product they had, everywhere from Windows to Office to .NET. Right, and that is, so I think now we're hopefully creating a language where we can actually meaningfully talk about how to treat security in a more strategic and thoughtful way.
Absolutely. So we've actually reached the stage of the webinar where it's usually time for questions, but as usual, we've been just enjoying the conversation and really just rolling along. So what I thought I might do right now is ask both of you to each give a closing paragraph or two before we wind this webinar officially up. So
James, I'll go first.
All right.
No, in fact, I'll go first just because I want to say, James, I think over the last decade, you've been one of those people who have really helped kind of reframe security, and you did that certainly for me. And I'm so excited that now more than ever, this is relevant to every technology organization and every business across every industry. So I'm super excited that I think now you have a more than receptive audience, and it includes every developer, ops, and security person, in the field. So thank you.
Hey, thanks, Gene. We're really excited about it. If I'd say, we just mentioned 3 really here, right? 3 principles that we feel are kind of coming out in the DevSecOps arenas. So if people are interested, I'd be happy to have more conversation with folks. I don't know, Rob, do we have my email up there, james@signalsciences.com. Maybe we could put it in the post notes or whatever, but
we'll do that.
Feel free to email me if you have stories, or if you have something that you would like to, you have questions about. I'd be happy to talk to you about that, and we'd love to have that in the book. And so we are excited. I'm very optimistic about security's place. I know, we started the talk with kind of like the security is in crisis. I think that is very representative of where operations was before DevOps happened. Now we see kind of the new now we see what's happened in that. I think security is going to see that same revitalization, and it's going to be really great. I mean, I think it's not just a way for security to survive. I mean, security is going to really thrive and grow in this kind of this new arena as we grow.
Awesome. Yeah, and you know, I totally concur. You know, for somebody who does security for fun and you know, looks and loves investing and investigating, especially now the new threat landscape of cybersecurity. It's time that you know, that we absolutely incorporate security into all we do, from secure coding practices to tech tools and techniques to ensure that we actually deliver the right pipeline. And you know, I really thank both of you. It's been great to be with both you today. And you know, this is one of my favorite topics. We should have scheduled this for 2 hours, not 1 hour. So with that said, we have a large number of resources at Zevia Labs that you can go and download and look at in terms of understanding more, both in this space and the areas of our product toolset. But with that said, in the interest of time, Jen, I'm just going to hand back to you to wrap up. And I thank everybody for joining us today.
And thank you, Rob and James. This is a treat and it's so educational for me. Thank you.
All right, right on. Yeah, thank you.
We would like to extend a very big thank you to Gene for joining us, to James as well. We're very excited to hear about your book when it becomes available. And as always, thank you, Rob, for adding insight. Have a great day, everyone.